The distress signal came through the deep space communication array at 0347 hours ship time. Captain Jake Morrison was drinking his morning coffee in the command center of the Earth Defense Force vessel Titan when the emergency beacon started, flashing red. The sound that filled the bridge was one that every spacer knew and feared. The universal distress call that meant people were dying somewhere in the black. Lieutenant Sam Rodriguez looked up from his tactical station and caught Jake's eye. They had been flying together for 3 years now, and Sam could read his captain's expression like a book. The question wasn't whether they would respond to the call. The question was how fast they could get there. "Amy, clean up that signal and put it on the main screen," Jake said to their communications officer. Amy Brooks had fingers that could dance across her control panel like a pianist playing a concert. Within seconds, the static cleared and a voice came through the speakers. The caller was a Zephyrian named Keth Mora. His voice was high and musical like all of his species, but there was raw terror in it that made every human on the bridge sit up straighter. He spoke in broken galactic common, and his words painted a picture of horror. The mining colony on Kepler 442b was gone. Not destroyed by war or accident, but overrun by creatures that had come from deep underground. A massive earthquake had split the planet's crust and awakened things that should have stayed sleeping. The colonists who survived the initial attack were trapped in 3 emergency shelters. Their power was failing. Their food was running out. Their weapons were useless against the creatures that stalked them day and night. 300 beings from 6 different species were going to die unless someone came to save them. The problem was that Kepler 442b was what the galaxy called a deathworld. Jake had heard the term before. Deathworlds were planets where the environment itself was hostile to most forms of life. High gravity that would crush the bones of species adapted to lighter worlds. Atmospheres filled with corrosive gases that could eat through standard protective gear. Weather patterns that could kill the unprepared in minutes. Radiation levels that would cook most aliens from the inside out. Earth was classified as a death world. Most species in the galaxy couldn't understand how anything could evolve on such a hostile planet. They looked at humans with a mixture of respect and horror. Respect because humans had somehow survived and thrived on a world that would kill them. Horror because any species that could survive Earth was probably dangerous. Dr. Lisa Turner finished her scan of the distress signal and looked at Jake with worry in her eyes. Lisa was their ship's doctor and xenobiologist. She had studied every known species in the galaxy and understood their limitations better than anyone. "Captain, the atmospheric readings from Kepler 442b are off the charts," she said. "The gravity is 3 times galactic standard. The air has sulfur compounds that would burn the lungs of most species. The radiation from the local star is intense enough to cause cellular damage in hours. Even if we could get there, the conditions on the surface would be lethal to most of the colonists within minutes of exposure." Chief Engineer Pete Collins looked up from his engineering station. Pete was a big man with hands that seemed too large for delicate work but could repair anything that had ever been built. He had been listening to the distress call with growing anger. "So what you're saying, Doc, is that this planet is trying to kill everything on it, and now there are monsters too," Pete said. "Sounds like the kind of place that needs some humans to sort it out." Jake smiled at that. Pete had been born on Mars, but his family came from Texas originally. He had never met a problem he didn't think could be solved with the right tools and enough determination. It was a very human attitude. "Amy, open a channel to Galactic Command," Jake ordered. "Let's see what the civilized species have to say about this." The response came back within minutes. The Galactic Council had received the same distress signal. Their military forces had analyzed the situation and reached a conclusion that chilled Jake's blood. The planet was too dangerous for a rescue mission. The environmental hazards combined with the unknown hostile life forms made any rescue attempt a suicide mission. The Council was prepared to send a memorial fleet to honor the dead, but they would not risk more lives on what they called an impossible mission. Jake stared at the official response for a long moment. 300 beings were going to die because their rescue was inconvenient, because the math didn't work out, because the risk was too high for civilized species to accept. "What's our distance to Kepler 442b?" he asked Amy. 18 hours at maximum burn, Captain," she replied immediately. "Sam, what's our tactical readiness?" We're carrying a full load of small arms and heavy weapons. Marine contingent is at full strength. Combat suits are all functional and tested. Pete, how's our girl holding up? The Titan is running at peak efficiency, Captain. She'll get us there and back with power to spare. Doc, what do our medical supplies look like? We're stocked for extended operations. I've got treatment protocols for all known galactic species. Jake looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These were humans who had volunteered to serve in space knowing that they might be called upon to fly into danger. They came from a world that had tried to kill their ancestors for millions of years, and they had the scars to prove it. They had conquered their own hostile planet and then reached for the stars. The Galactic Council saw Kepler 442b as a deathworld too dangerous to approach, but Jake's crew came from a deathworld. The difference was that humans had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill other species. They had turned their hostile environment into their greatest strength. Amy, send a message to the survivors. On Kepler 442b, Jake said. Tell them Earth Defense Force is en route. Tell them to hold on because the cavalry is coming. What about Galactic Command? Sam asked. Jake's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Tell them we received their recommendation, and we'll take it under advisement. Then tell them that humans don't leave people to die just because it's dangerous to save them. The Titan turned toward Kepler 442b and increased speed. Behind them, the galaxy watched in fascination and horror as the deathworlders of Earth did what they always did when others needed help. They answered the call regardless of the cost. The Titan dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system and immediately began scanning for threats. What they found made even Jake Morrison pause for a moment. The space around the planet was filled with debris from ships that had tried to escape and failed. Twisted metal and scattered hull fragments told the story of evacuation vessels that never made it out of the atmosphere. Amy Brooks ran her fingers across her communication console and shook her head. Captain, I'm reading emergency beacons from at least 12 different ships. All of them went dark within the last 72 hours. Whatever happened down there happened fast. Dr. Lisa Turner was studying the planetary scans on her medical station screen. The readings made her stomach turn. The massive earthquake that had triggered this disaster had literally reshaped the planet's surface. Mountain ranges that existed on old survey maps were gone. New chasms split the ground for hundreds of kilometers. The geological trauma had been so severe that it registered on their sensors from orbit. The seismic activity was off the scale, Lisa reported. Magnitude 9.8 on the planetary scale. That's enough to flatten cities and split continents. But the really disturbing part is what came up from the deep crust layers. I'm reading massive cavern systems that were previously sealed. Whatever was living down there had been trapped for possibly millions of years. Lieutenant Sam Rodriguez was tracking the 3 emergency shelter locations on his tactical display. The shelters were scattered across different continents, and all of them were showing critical power levels. The northernmost complex was in the worst shape. Their generators were failing and their defensive barriers were fluctuating. Captain, we've got maybe 16 hours before the first shelter goes completely dark, Sam reported. After that, the colonists inside will be exposed to whatever is hunting them out there. Pete Collins had been running diagnostics on the Titan systems ever since they arrived in the system. The big engineer was frowning at his readouts. The planet's atmosphere was already starting to affect their ship just from orbital distance. Skipper, that atmosphere down there is nasty stuff, Pete said. High sulfur content, trace amounts of chlorine gas, and some kind of metallic particles that are probably from all the volcanic activity. Our hull can handle it, but not for long. The longer we stay in atmosphere, the more damage we're going to take. Jake nodded, but kept his eyes on the planet below. Somewhere down there, 300 people from different worlds were waiting to die. The galaxy had written them off as acceptable losses. The civilized species had done their math and decided these lives weren't worth the risk. But humans didn't do math when people needed help. They did what needed to be done. Amy, are you picking up any communications from the surface? Jake asked. Weak. Signals from all 3 locations, Captain. The colonists are trying to maintain contact with each other, but the atmospheric interference is making it difficult. I'm also picking up something else. There are organized movement patterns around each shelter. Whatever is down there isn't just wandering around randomly. They're coordinating their attacks. Dr. Turner looked up from her analysis with concern written across her face. Captain, I've been studying the limited data we have on these creatures. The colonists managed to get some visual recordings before their external cameras were destroyed. These things are unlike anything in the Galactic database. She transferred the images to the main screen and Jake felt his crew go silent. The creatures looked like living nightmares. They stood roughly 2 meters tall on powerful legs that ended in clawed feet. Their bodies were covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating that had a metallic sheen. Most disturbing were their heads, which were elongated and filled with rows of sharp teeth. But it was their arms that drew everyone's attention. Instead of hands, they had appendages that could apparently spray some kind of corrosive liquid. Silicon-based life forms, Lisa continued. They've evolved in high-gravity, high-radiation conditions deep underground. The armor plating is actually crystallized minerals from their environment. Those appendages can spit acid strong enough to eat through most galactic standard metals. They hunt in coordinated packs and they seem to be attracted to electromagnetic signatures. Sam studied the tactical implications. So they're drawn to the colonists' technology. Every power source, every communication device, every life support system is basically sending out a dinner bell. That's correct, Lisa replied. And based on the attack patterns the colonists described, these creatures are learning. Each assault is more organized than the last. They're not just animals reacting to territory invasion. They're intelligent hunters adapting to their prey. Pete scratched his beard and looked thoughtful. So we've got smart monsters that spit acid and hunt in packs on a planet that's trying to kill us just by breathing the air. And the folks we're supposed to rescue are scattered across 3 different locations with failing power and no way to defend themselves. That about sums it up, Jake replied. Sounds like a regular Tuesday, Pete said with a grin. Jake almost smiled at that. Pete's attitude was typical of humans. Present them with impossible odds and they didn't calculate failure rates. They figured out how to win anyway. Amy, open a channel to the planet's surface. All 3 locations. Within moments, the main screen filled with faces from different species. There was Keth Mora, the Zephyrian who had sent the original distress call. His delicate features were drawn with exhaustion and fear. Next to him was a Centauran female whose normally blue skin had turned pale with stress. A group of Altarian engineers huddled in the background of one screen, while Hydran colonists in environmental suits filled another. These were beings from worlds where nature was gentle and cooperative. They had never faced anything like the nightmare that Kepler 442b had become. They looked at Jake with the desperate hope of people who knew they were going to die unless someone saved them. This is Captain Jake Morrison of Earth Defense Force, Jake said in his calm command voice. We received your distress call and we're here to get you out. I need each location to give me your current status, including number of survivors, power, levels, and defensive capabilities. The reports that came back were worse than Jake had expected. The northern shelter had 87 colonists, but their barriers would fail within 12 hours. The eastern complex had 43 survivors, including several critically injured, who couldn't be moved easily. The southern facility had 170 people, but they were completely surrounded and under constant attack. When the reports finished, there was silence on all channels. Everyone was waiting to hear what the humans would do. The galaxy expected them to make the smart choice and retreat. After all, even deathworlders had limits. Jake looked at his crew and saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his heart. These weren't just colonists trapped on a hostile world. They were people who had asked for help. All stations, this is Titan Actual, Jake said. We're coming down to get you. Have your people ready to move fast when we arrive. This is a rescue operation and nobody gets left behind. The dropship screamed through the atmosphere of Kepler 442b like a falling star. Captain Jake Morrison gripped his harness as the small craft bucked and rolled through the turbulent air. The planet's atmosphere was trying to eat their ship alive. Corrosive gases hammered against the hull, while electromagnetic storms played havoc with their navigation systems. Lieutenant Sam Rodriguez was strapped in beside Jake, checking his weapons for the 3rd time. The tactical officer had loaded for bear, as humans like to say. His rifle could punch holes through standard galactic armor, and his sidearm fired explosive rounds designed for close-quarters combat. But even Sam looked nervous as he watched the hostile readings on his scanner. Dr. Lisa Turner sat across from them, reviewing the medical supplies one more time. She had packed everything she could think of, including trauma kits designed for 6 different species. The problem was that most of her patients would be aliens whose biology she knew from textbooks rather than experience. She would have to learn fast if any of them were going to survive. Chief Engineer Pete Collins was in the pilot seat, wrestling with controls that wanted to do anything except what he told them. The dropship was built tough, but the atmosphere was testing every system they had. Warning lights flashed across his control panel like angry red stars. 2 minutes to landing zone. Pete called over the noise of tortured metal and screaming engines. Hope everybody packed their dancing shoes, because this is going to be a rough one. The first emergency shelter sat in what had once been a mining facility. Now it looked like a fortress under siege. The buildings were surrounded by massive creatures that moved with deadly purpose. Jake could see them through the dropships, cameras as they circled the complex like sharks sensing wounded prey. The creatures were even more terrifying in person than they had appeared on the colonists' recordings. They stood over 2 meters tall on legs like tree trunks. Their armored hide reflected the planet's harsh sunlight like polished metal. Most disturbing were their movements. These weren't mindless beasts. They were coordinated hunters who had learned to work together. Landing in 10 seconds, Pete announced. Everyone hold on to something solid. The dropship hit the ground hard enough to rattle Jake's teeth. Before the engines had fully spun down, Sam was already moving toward the exit ramp. The tactical officer moved with the fluid grace of someone who had done combat drops on a dozen different worlds. This was just another day at the office for Earth's military. The ramp dropped and Jake got his first taste of Kepler 442b's atmosphere. Even through his combat suit's filtration system, he could smell sulfur and ozone. The gravity hit him like a physical blow. 3 times Earth normal meant that every step took real effort. For someone from a lighter world, it would have been crushing. But humans came from a heavy world. Jake had trained in gravitational fields twice as strong as this. His crew moved across the rocky ground with steady confidence while the creatures that had seemed so terrifying from orbit suddenly found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. Predators from a deathworld. The first creature that rushed them learned what human weapons could do to living tissue. Sam's rifle spoke once, and the beast's armored head exploded in a shower of crystalline fragments. The other creatures stopped their advance and began circling more cautiously. They were smart enough to recognize a new and dangerous threat. Move fast and stay together, Jake ordered as they reached the shelter's outer barrier. The energy field was flickering like a dying light bulb. Through the translucent barrier, he could see faces pressed against windows. Aliens from half a dozen. Worlds were watching the humans with expressions of amazement and terror. The colonists had never seen humans in combat before. In the Galactic Council chambers, humans always appeared civilized and diplomatic. They wore suits and spoke in measured tones about trade agreements and territorial disputes. But now the colonists were seeing humans as nature had made them. Apex predators who had chosen to hunt for others rather than against them. Pete worked, his engineering magic on the barrier controls while Sam and Jake provided security. The big Texan's hands flew across alien control systems with surprising delicacy. Within minutes, he had the barrier stable enough for them to pass through. The inside of the shelter was a scene from a nightmare. 87 beings from 6 different species were crammed into a space designed for maybe 30. The air recycling system was failing, which meant the atmosphere was becoming toxic even for those with breathing apparatus. Several colonists were lying on makeshift beds with injuries from the creature attacks. But what struck Jake most was the silence. These beings had given up hope. They were waiting to die with the quiet resignation of prey animals that knew the predators were coming. That changed the moment the humans walked through the door. A young Centauran male looked at Jake with wide eyes. His species was built tall and thin for life on a low-gravity world. The crushing weight of Kepler 442b should have killed him within hours. Only the shelter's internal gravity compensators were keeping him alive. "You came," the Centauran whispered. We sent the distress call, but the council said it was too dangerous. They said no one would risk a rescue mission. Jake knelt beside the young alien and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Through his combat suit, he could feel how fragile the colonist was. One wrong move in this gravity would snap bones like twigs. The council was wrong, Jake replied. Humans don't abandon people who need help. We're going to get all of you out of here. Dr. Turner was already moving through the shelter, checking on the injured. She worked with quick efficiency as she administered painkillers and stabilized critical cases. Her movements were sure and confident despite the alien physiology she was treating. The colonists watched her work with growing amazement. Here was a human who had dropped into hell itself to provide medical care to beings she had never met. It was their first real glimpse of what humanity was truly like beneath the diplomatic facade. Sam had taken position at the shelter's main entrance and was monitoring the creatures outside. The beasts had backed away from the human weapons, but they weren't retreating. If anything, their numbers were growing as more emerged from the underground tunnels. "Captain, we've got a problem," Sam reported. "These things are calling in reinforcements. I count at least 30 now and more are coming. They're also changing their tactics. Instead of rushing us, they're trying to surround the building." Jake nodded grimly. The creatures were adapting to human tactics faster than he had hoped. That suggested an intelligence level that made them even more dangerous. Pete finished his work on the shelter's systems and turned to Jake with a grim expression. "I've got life support stable for now, but it's not going to last long. The power cells are nearly drained and I can't fix the main generator without parts we don't have. We need to evacuate these people soon, or the shelter is going to become their tomb." Jake looked around at the faces watching him. Fear and hope warred in alien eyes as they waited to hear what the deathworlders would do next. The smart move would be to take who they could carry and run, cut their losses, and save who they could save. But humans had never been smart that way. The evacuation of the first shelter took 4 hours of careful planning and steady nerves. Jake Morrison organized the colonists into groups based on their physical abilities and medical needs. The most fragile beings would go first, while those who could still fight would help defend the others during transport. Getting 87 aliens off a hostile world while surrounded by pack hunters required more than just courage. It needed the kind of tactical thinking that humans had learned during millions of years of being both predator and prey on their own death world. Sam Rodriguez established a defensive perimeter using portable barriers and automated turrets. The weapons were designed to work in Earth's harsh conditions, which meant they functioned perfectly in Kepler 442b's hostile environment. The creatures learned quickly to avoid the kill zones, but they never stopped watching for weakness. Dr. Turner worked steadily to prepare the injured for transport. Several colonists had suffered acid burns from creature attacks, and their alien physiology made treatment challenging. But Lisa had studied xenobiology for years, and her hands were steady as she administered medications and stabilized critical patients. Pete Collins performed miracles with the shelter's failing systems. The big engineer managed to boost power long enough to strengthen the barriers and improve life support. His tools were designed for human technology, but Pete had the kind of mechanical intuition that transcended species boundaries. The first group of colonists made it to the dropship without incident. Jake personally carried a young Zephyrian whose delicate bone structure couldn't handle the planet's crushing gravity. The alien weighed almost nothing in Jake's arms, but each step across the rocky ground was a reminder that these beings were never meant to survive in such conditions. The second group faced more resistance. The creatures had learned to coordinate their attacks, and they rushed the humans from multiple directions at once. Sam's weapons training proved its worth as he dropped 3 of the beasts in rapid succession. But more kept coming, and Jake realized they were dealing with intelligence that bordered on tactical genius. By the time the third group reached the dropship, Pete's jury-rigged repairs were starting to fail. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits while the barrier flickered like a dying candle. The creatures sensed weakness and pressed their attack with renewed fury. "Last group coming out," Jake announced over the radio as he helped an elderly Altarian engineer toward the ship. Behind them, the shelter's lights were going dark one by one as systems finally gave up their struggle against entropy and hostile conditions. The final sprint to the dropship became a running battle. Creatures erupted from underground tunnels that hadn't shown up on their scanners. Acid spit hissed through the air close enough to Jake's helmet that he could hear it eating through his armor's outer layer. Sam covered their retreat with disciplined fire that dropped creatures as fast as they appeared. His movements were fluid and precise despite the crushing gravity that would have left most aliens unable to stand. This was what humans looked like when they fought for others instead of themselves. The dropship lifted off just as the shelter's main generator exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Below them, the creatures howled their frustration at prey that had escaped their trap. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. The second shelter presented different challenges. It was built partially underground using natural cave systems. For protection, the 43 colonists trapped there included several who were too injured to move, and a Zephyrian engineer whose respiratory system was failing in the planet's toxic atmosphere. "We're going into the tunnels," Jake announced to his crew as they studied the shelter's layout. The words sent a chill through the rescued colonists who were listening from the dropship's passenger compartment. They knew what lived in those dark spaces beneath the surface. But humans had evolved in caves and forests where anything could be hiding in the shadows. They didn't fear the dark because they had learned to make it their ally. Other species used technology to push back the night. Humans embraced it and made it part of their hunting strategy. The tunnel approach required different tactics. The creatures had home field advantage in the narrow passages where their acid could ricochet off walls, and their claws could strike from unexpected angles. But the confined space also meant that human weapons were devastatingly effective at close range. Pete rigged portable life support systems for the colonists while maintaining their equipment in conditions that would shut down most galactic technology. The engineer worked by feel in spaces so cramped that his broad shoulders barely fit through the passages. Amy Brooks established communication relays through solid rock using techniques developed for Earth's deepest mines and highest mountains. Her equipment was designed to work in environments where other species couldn't even survive long enough to attempt repairs. Deep in the tunnel system, they encountered something that made even Sam pause. A creature larger than the others stood blocking their path. It didn't attack immediately but studied them with intelligence that was almost human in its calculation. This was the pack leader, and it was evaluating these new predators that had invaded its territory. Dr. Turner realized they were facing something unprecedented. This wasn't just an animal defending territory. This was a thinking being that had survived by being smarter and stronger than everything else in its world. The kind of apex predator that Earth produced in abundance. The battle in the tunnels was fought on terms that favored neither side. The creature's acid bounced off tunnel walls while human weapons echoed like thunder in the confined space. But humans had advantages that the beast couldn't match. They could think tactically and adapt their strategy in real time. Jake used the tunnel's geometry against the creature by forcing it into a crossfire position. Sam flanked it through a side passage that his smaller human frame could navigate. Pete collapsed a section of ceiling to limit the creature's escape routes, while Lisa treated wounded colonists under fire. When the smoke cleared, the pack leader lay dead, and the path to the second shelter was open. But the cost was rising. Pete had taken acid burns on his arm that ate through his armor's protection. Amy's communication gear was damaged and sparking. Even Jake was breathing hard in the toxic atmosphere. The colonists they rescued from the underground complex looked at the humans with something approaching awe. These beings had descended into hell itself and emerged victorious. They had fought monsters in their own domain, and won through skill and determination that defied galactic understanding. But as they reached the surface, Jake received news that chilled his blood. The third shelter had gone completely dark. No communications, no power signatures, no signs of life from the complex that housed 170 colonists. The galactic monitoring stations were already broadcasting memorial services. The civilized species had accepted that the largest group of survivors was lost. They spoke of acceptable casualties and the limits of reasonable rescue attempts. Jake looked at his tired and injured crew, then keyed his radio to broadcast on all galactic frequencies. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of Earth Defense Force," he said in a voice that carried across star systems. "We're going after the third shelter. All survivors will be recovered. This is not a request for permission or approval. This is a statement of intent." Across the galaxy, beings from dozens of worlds tuned in to watch what they assumed would be humanity's final gesture. They expected to witness the deathworlders finally meet their match. They were about to learn what humans meant when they said nobody gets left behind. The third emergency shelter looked like a fortress that had been under siege for days. Massive creatures surrounded the complex in numbers that made Jake Morrison's tactical mind race through calculations he didn't like. But the most important detail was the faint energy signature coming from the main building. The colonists were still alive. Captain Jake Morrison stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking the shelter and made a decision that would echo through galactic history. Instead of trying to sneak in or establish a careful perimeter, he activated his suit's external speakers and broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of Earth Defense Force." His voice carried across the battlefield and up to the orbital monitoring stations. "We're here for pickup. Please have your bags packed." The message reached every galactic monitoring station within range. Beings from dozens of worlds stopped what they were doing to listen as humans announced their intention to attempt the impossible. The smart money said the deathworlders had finally found something that would kill them. The creatures surrounding the shelter turned toward Jake's position, with movements that spoke of deadly intelligence. These weren't the scattered packs they had faced at the other locations. This was a coordinated army that had been learning human tactics and adapting their strategy accordingly. Lieutenant Sam Rodriguez took position on Jake's left flank and sighted his rifle on the largest creature he could see. The tactical officer had been counting targets and the numbers weren't encouraging. But humans had never won their battles through superior numbers. They won through superior determination. Dr. Lisa Turner was studying the creatures through her scanner and making discoveries that changed everything. These beings weren't evil or malicious. They were territorial animals that had been driven from their deep habitat by geological disaster. The earthquake hadn't just awakened them. It had destroyed their home and forced them to the surface in a desperate search for new territory. "Captain," Lisa called over the radio, "these creatures aren't attacking out of hunger or aggression. They're defending what they think is their new home. The seismic activity collapsed their underground habitat and they're trying to establish a new one on the surface." Jake absorbed this information while planning his assault. In any other situation, humans would probably try to help these creatures find a new home that didn't conflict with colonial settlements. But today, the colonists came first. Today, these beings were obstacles between his crew and people who needed. Rescue. Chief Engineer Pete Collins had been monitoring their equipment, and his reports weren't encouraging. The Titan was taking damage from extended exposure to the planet's corrosive atmosphere. Their dropship's engines were showing stress fractures from the heavy gravity. Even their personal gear was degrading faster than expected. "Skipper, we need to finish this fast," Pete reported. "Our gear is tough, but this planet is tougher. We've got maybe 2 hours before we start losing critical systems." The assault on the third shelter became a showcase of human tactical thinking. Instead of trying to fight through the creature army, Jake used their intelligence against them. He had Amy broadcast a false retreat signal, while Sam provided covering fire from a secondary position. The creatures took the bait and moved to intercept the humans' apparent escape route. While the creature army repositioned itself, Jake led Pete and Lisa through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the shelter's lower level. The passage was barely wide enough for human shoulders and filled with toxic gases that would have killed most galactic species in minutes. But humans wore environmental suits designed for the worst conditions imaginable. Inside the shelter, they found 170 colonists in various states of exhaustion and terror. These beings had been under constant attack for days with failing life support and dwindling hope. They looked at the humans with expressions that mixed disbelief with desperate gratitude. The colonists had never imagined that anyone would actually come for them. The galactic powers had written them off as acceptable losses. The civilized species had calculated the cost of rescue and found it too high to pay. But humans had come anyway, because that's what humans did when people needed help. Getting one 170 aliens off a hostile planet while surrounded by intelligent predators required more than just courage. It needed the kind of coordination that humans had learned through countless battles on countless worlds. But this time, they weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting to save lives that belonged to species they had never met. The evacuation became a running battle through corridors filled with acid and claw marks. Pete Collins used his engineering skills to turn the shelter's failing systems into weapons. Overloaded power cells became improvised explosives, while damaged life support units created smoke screens that confused the creature's senses. Dr. Turner worked under fire to stabilize critical patients while coordinating triage for colonists, with injuries ranging from acid burns to crushing trauma. Her medical training covered dozens of species, but she had to improvise treatments for physiologies she had only read about in textbooks. Sam Rodriguez fought a tactical withdrawal that kept the creatures from overwhelming their position while allowing steady evacuation of colonists. His weapons training and combat experience turned the shelter's layout into a fortress that protected the innocent while punishing their attackers. But the real miracle was Jake Morrison himself. The captain moved through the chaos with calm authority that kept both his crew and the colonists focused on survival rather than panic. He carried injured aliens who couldn't walk and coordinated defensive positions while managing resources that were stretched beyond their limits. The final group of colonists reached the dropship just as Pete's improvised repairs finally failed. The shelter's main structure collapsed in a cascade of sparks and twisted metal, while creatures poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. The dropship lifted off with engines that screamed protest at the overload. 170 additional passengers pushed the small craft beyond its design limits, but Pete Collins had never built anything that gave up without a fight. The ship clawed its way through the toxic atmosphere toward orbital safety. But their troubles weren't over. The dropship's engines were failing and they were too heavy to reach escape velocity. The Titan would have to descend into the atmosphere to provide emergency assistance. It was a maneuver that could destroy both ships, but Jake never hesitated to give the order. Pete Collins performed one last miracle of engineering. He rerouted power through systems that weren't designed to handle the load, and somehow kept both ships flying long enough to reach orbit. It was the kind of impossible solution that humans specialized in when the situation was desperate enough. As the Titan cleared the planet's gravity well and prepared for hyperspace, Jake looked at the 300 survivors crowded into his ship. Beings from 6 different worlds owed their lives to a crew of 4 humans who had refused to accept that some rescues were impossible. The colonists would return to their worlds with stories of the deathworlders who had descended into hell itself to save strangers. They would tell of humans who fought monsters and won through courage and determination that defied galactic understanding. But Jake Morrison knew the real truth. His crew hadn't done anything special. They had just done what anyone should do when people needed help. The fact that other species found it remarkable said more about the galaxy than it did about humanity. The rescue of Kepler 442b became legend across the galaxy. It was the day that beings from dozens of worlds learned what humans meant when they said that nobody gets left behind. It was the day the deathworlders proved that they used their strength to protect rather than conquer. And somewhere in the depths of space, other distress calls were waiting for the only species that considered impossible rescues to be just another day at the office.